Hello, welcome back to our conversation. Fun, eh? No, no fun. Okay. So, we are honored to have here with us to discuss the work of Yorgos Lanthimos and Greek contemporary cinema, two experts on the field. We're welcoming Dr. Tonia Kazakopoulou. She is a lecturer at the University of Reading. Her research interests include women's cinema of small nations, contemporary European and world cinemas. She has been the curator of the International Standing Conference Contemporary Greek Film Studies, Cultures, and she has also published on women's cinema, on Greek women screenwriters, on contemporary Greek cinema and motherhood, as well as the female characters in Yorgos Lanthimos films. Please welcome her. We also have Dr. Falvey, who is an independent film scholar. His work mostly focuses on industrial film histories and the diversities of cult cinema. He is the author of Reanimator, as well as editor of Refocus, the films of Nicholas Wilding Refn, the cinema of Yorgos Lanthimos, films, form, philosophy, and new blood, critical approaches to contemporary horror. I know we promised you a third person by Dr. Eleftheria Aranya Kosmidou, but she had a health emergency and she couldn't join us, unfortunately. Anyway, so let's get on. So I want to ask both of you. We know this is the last film Lanthimos made in Greece and in Greek. What is its position, do you think, in his filmography in terms of the development of his concepts in general?
Shall I go first? Yeah. I suppose it's an interesting film because it's coming on the back of Dogtooth, which is arguably a much more visceral, impactful film in kind of a more in terms of its extremity. This film certainly feels a little bit more glacial. It bears a lot in common with Dogtooth. That same sort of emphasis on power structures, on sort of family dimensions, like both kind of actual families and kind of found families, which kind of feature quite heavily in Lanthimos' cinema. But at the same time, there seems to be this kind of, I suppose, what I would call this unresolved ambivalence to his style that really kind of underscores his Greek language cinema more so than his English language cinema going forward. So certainly The Lobster, Killing of a Sacred Deer, I suppose tends to be kind of more concrete in kind of the things it's trying to do. Whereas this one, and actually this one I'd say even more so than Dogtooth, is perhaps like the most obtuse kind of his films, with the exception of Kineta, his very first film, one that's often kind of like neglected when people look at Lanthimos' cinema, which actually does share some interesting things in common with this. So it's kind of it kind of marks, I suppose, this transition both in an industrial context, shifting away from working with Greek actors in the Greek language to sort of moving into a much more sort of transnational scene. Already there was kind of a transnational element to Alps. It was financed not just by Greek studios, but also by studios in France and Britain as well, as far as I'm aware, sort of reflecting the fact that actually financially there was quite a lot going on at the time, and co-productions were necessary to get these films made. So I suppose it's kind of a film marking a transition would be a way I'd sort of think about it.
Yeah, possibly. I'm not sure about the transition because it seemed to me that that was not necessarily something planned, but something that kind of events kind of necessitated to move forward. In terms of his filmography, I would place it. I would say that this is one of the films that they very explicitly make a commentary on current times of crisis, of financial hardship, of people making do. More than his other films that are a bit more ambivalent about that, or they don't want to make a direct commentary. Here you have a group of people who are finding the most peculiar way of making ends meet, in my view. So there is a more direct kind of approach, or is there a better word than approach? There is a more direct commentary, perhaps, on realities of the time, not only Greece, but internationally, in my view. The fact that he gets to move is because the film just doesn't have money to be fully produced and distributed in Greece. So there is for sure a transitional point. I find this film in his filmography is one of those that dare to comment a bit more actively than others that are a bit more obscure, perhaps.
So you disagree, both of you? I'm joking. So another thing is Monte Rosa, which is played by Angeliki Papoulia, is punished in the film for rebelling against the organization of Alps. But then we see her getting punished in a way. How is it similar or different in how from other women depicted in Lanthimos cinema?
I personally don't think it's different at all. I think there is a punishing regime that Lanthimos inscribes in all his films, Greek or English speaking, that affect women. These regimes affect women primarily and most severely. There is a critical element in that he I think identifies that there is a system or various set of systems perhaps at play where women cannot break through. I think there's also something that where my argument with Lanthimos's filmmaking lies, I guess, and what I reflect on in my writing, in that his way of filming this, at the same time that he's trying to critique it, he reproduces a certain kind of set of systems that entrap, or systems of representation, I should say, that entrap women within. So there is no escape. There is no escape, and I find that quite scary as a female viewer in particular. But I don't find that this is the film that punishes one female character. I think female characters in his films more generally need further attention in the kind of lives and the kind of opportunities and the kind of systems within which they operate and they are given, which are very, very limited. And certainly there is a restriction then that happens in the filmography, in the filmmaking itself.
I suppose this is argument exemplified mostly with the reactions in Poor Things, where half of women were like, this is really liberating and what a feminist film. There was the other camp, which was like, this is the opposite of a feminist film. So it's very interesting, his way of looking at women. At the least, it's interesting.
Yes, I would... I think there is some distance between Lanthimos and feminism, to start with. I don't think he's unfeminist, let's put it this way, but I think there is some distance, and I don't think that's his aim either. It's interesting that he chooses to work with female characters, and he puts them right there at the forefront. But I guess the question for us as viewers is to ask, is this enough? What purpose does this fulfill in the end? With Poor Things, my primary problem with it when I watched it was that there's hardly a questioning in the film that the first part of this character's life as a newborn creature, let's say, as a newborn woman, people characterize it, if I remember correctly, in most of the reviews that I read, as this kind of reawakening and finding, her sexuality. And I was gasping at the idea that this is actually sanctioned rape of a person who, since they are very young in mind and they're still learning, they don't have the agency to give consent. This is non-consensual sex, and that, what is that other than rape? And to see it as some kind of liberation was at least problematic for me, because the premise on which it's set is indeed problematic. This is a person, this is a character who for some of her life cannot give consent in what she's experiencing and what she's encountering. And so that's why I say that there is some distance there from feminism, but there is certainly this is a film that is open to feminist critique for sure.
So, although Alps is clearly a film about grief, it's remarkably detached and distanced, as a lot of his films, and a lot of the films we're going to be discussing tonight. Why do you think it's that?
Distance in which terms?
In the way of the cinematic language. The dialogue is monotone.
Kind of stilted and...
Yeah, kind of stilted, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an aesthetic style, but at the same time, there is something to say about what reaction it encourages from an audience member, and that is for me discomfort, at least. So I guess, yeah, distant. I didn't find it distant at all, personally. I thought that in this kind of more art house aesthetics that it kind of finds itself in, and drawing on some key characteristics from recognizable kind of genre aesthetics, that it kind of appeals to the audience and at the same time creates this kind of discomfort, because we're never comfortable in any one style or in any one way of speaking to us. And I think the emotion does not necessarily need to reside in the film, but it can reside with the audience and how we react to that. So I guess, yeah, I don't know if distance would be the word I would use, because there's an approach there to the audience to we squirm when we watch these films, at least I do, that there is kind of, there's absolutely emotion there, for sure.
Yeah, I think the way that it kind of almost creates this space for us as viewers to project into is part of the kind of the way in which a Lanthimos film works on you. And actually it's something that kind of has gone away a little bit as his career has gone on. This kind of like almost glaciation that kind of characterizes this like affectless sort of deadpan delivery. It really sets us up to be a much more kind of active viewer when we're watching it, because when you strip something of kind of it of like a strong emotional register, you're forced to kind of compensate. You have to reflect on, how the style creates in it this like rather absurd kind of set of interactions occasionally. Like in Alps, for instance, you there's only a few times where you really kind of get sort of like a felt emotional reaction to something, in terms of like there's the bit where she's laughing during the sex that she has with the light fitting shop owner, and there's a few other moments as well where she cries, and but for the rest of it we're sort of presented with this relatively absurd situation. They have formed a sort of a strangely kind of like cultish company who substitutes themselves for loved ones, and the film almost teases us to first of all be more interested in the people who would be interested in such a strange sort of situation, before kind of like almost baiting and switching us to the individuals who would participate in such a thing. And yeah, I think Tonia's absolutely right. The kind of the economics, the fact that this is work for them, and actually, part of the way in which the film sort of slowly breaks down that distinction between fantasy and reality, also kind of like labor. Like there's a point at which Monterosa's kind of commitment to the work goes further and further and further, draws on ethical questions about work itself, and then but also kind of opens up all of the kind of the weirdnesses of all of these things as well. So I suppose going back to the question about kind of this distanced style, I kind of on the one hand agree with that observation that it feels somewhat detached. I don't think it's like emotionally kind of lacking. I think what it's trying to do is invite a more active form of spectatorship where we are and that's part of like the absurdity of it all, that we're kind of asked to grapple with, you know, how these characters are interacting with one another, the strange nature of the predicaments that they found themselves in, and from that sort of start to sort of think a little bit about these strange connections that we all sort of have in you know, late modernity. And you know, that seems to be one of the things that he, you know, that kind of that bereftness of connection seems to be one of the things that Lanthimos really takes aim at in this film, and then in The Lobster as well, you know, with the kind of the strange hotel situation they've got there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add something here? I think I wonder if at the time that the film was being made, and some of his earlier ones, Dogtooth, and even the one just after that with The Lobster, if there is indeed, at least in Greece, a different language one could have used for a film such as this. And I appreciate the aesthetic choice here to allow audiences to bring their own selves into or when watching these films, rather than impose an emotional register. We're talking about a sociocultural collapse apart from the economic one, and there is no language really. And I think the films, his films, at least the Greek-speaking ones, reflect that. It becomes a style, and we can discuss about that, I guess. That continues to his English-speaking work. But thinking about how you address a topic such as the one in Alps, what language can you use that wouldn't feel, I don't know, a bit artificial? I think the choice of that detachment, I guess you said, so it feels detached, but at the same time there is an engagement there with a situation where systems as we knew them have failed, and so maybe that kind of representation is the appropriate one for the time that the film speaks to its audience.
Very interesting point. So, speaking about Greek cinema and the time, what do you think that differentiates films after the 2000s in Greece compared to cinema that was created before?
In my view, there are some things that differentiate films, at least those ones that make it abroad and make it to festivals. But there's also a continuity that starts before that and sets the scene, if you want, for the kind of co-productions, for the kind of cinema of collaboration that we see, particularly in the kind of so-called weird wave, which I'm sure we're going to discuss soon. But I think there is we cannot discard the before and say there is a clear line with the after. I think
for marketing reasons.
Yeah. I mean, yes, you do things for all sorts of reasons. You can call a bunch of films weird wave because it's catchy, it's great, it has alliteration, it works. But at the same time, I think we need to see Greek cinema holistically and how it comes to produce this set of films. And I think, for instance, in the 90s and a little bit before that, when you have that kind of change and kind of deregulation, and you have private sector entering the filmmaking business and support, where money comes from different places that it didn't come before, that creates a different set of dynamics and different ways of experimentation that leads the way to what we see with Lanthimos from the 2000s and others, and many others after that. And they don't all look the same, precisely because there is an opportunity and an opening up to find different ways of making film. There isn't just a single track methodology or way of funding or way of promoting or accessing audiences. I think for me
did
that's
it reflect the themes, this change in the process of financing them?
well, there is a cinema that becomes more popular abroad that reflects certain themes that are more kind of international, but at the same time there is a homegrown cinema that we haven't watched in London, for instance. So popular cinema for homegrown audiences is still happening, as far as I know, but it just doesn't travel abroad. This is a group of films that made it to international audiences and created a certain hype around them and address. I think they captured the zeitgeist of the moment internationally, not just in Greece. But Greece benefited from it because that tiny country suddenly enters kind of the international film world, in my view.
So the small crisis of Greece resonated with the larger crisis after 2008
I believe
globally.
So. I don't think Greece was the only one who was undergoing a form of crisis at the time, or still isn't. I think people identified with the idea of crisis and found in these films various kinds of crisis to relate to. Greece was in the limelight because of the kind of financial turmoil and the memoranda of understanding and so on. It became kind of an own entity, if you want, for that reason, but its cultural production was there. It attracted attention perhaps for this reason, but I think it found an audience for many other more complex ideas, including the idea that people related.
What are the
crisis.
elements then that people relate globally with these films, you think?
Precarity, uncertainty, the idea of self. There are a number of reasons. Our position in relation to systems and cultures.
Governing.
So I think absolutely systems of governmentality for sure.
Which is an obsession in Lanthimos' work. I think
throughout.
even throughout until now with Poor Things, it becomes lighter and funnier, but still it's about governing and systems of control and surveillance and governing the body.
It's
as
pretty
well.
universal, isn't it?
Yeah. I also think that in terms of just exposure, there's something to be said about like serious cinema as well, and the way that kind of fits within like festival expectations. You know, Lanthimos's films broke out at a point when he was making, you know, Dogtooth, which is, you know, a funny film, if you can laugh at it, but also
if you don't choke.
yeah, but also a piece of serious cinema, which therefore gives it a certain prestige on the award circuit. I actually, correcting myself, saying something earlier, that Lanthimos's first film was Curator. That's not actually true. His first film was My Best Friend, which was a romantic comedy that he produced. And, you know, and this is what, you know, you're talking about.
He tries not to speak about it very much.
Pardon?
He doesn't like to speak about this very much.
I'll be in trouble for mentioning it. But that does kind of express this kind of like, well, I suppose it also expresses this kind of expectation that to be a serious filmmaker or be regarded as an auteur, then you do need to leave behind certain, you know, those popular, you know, domestic films, you know, comedies, you know, they do sometimes break through those international lines, but not in the same way that, like, you know, if you position, say, Dogtooth in relation to European extreme cinema of the 90s and to, you know, Lars von Trier and Misha Haneke and, you know, filmmakers like that, you can kind of see, you know, again, kind of going against the notion of kind of like collecting these films around like a Greek aesthetic sensibility, this kind of transnational sort of directive to use kind of extreme style, extreme forms to comment on, you know, local or kind of more global issues. But certainly there is a way of looking at a film like Dogtooth as being not necessarily part of, but kind of like happening in the aftermath of that sort of new extremism that was happening in the 90s.
So I'm quoting Tsagari here, who says, one thing that does unite Greece's new generation is a preoccupation with family. It's a Greek obsession. The reason our politics and economy is in trouble is that it's run as a family. In a larger sense, young Greeks are up against the tyranny of their ancestry or Greece's nostalgia for its own history. End of quote. Can you talk a little bit about family as it's represented in modern Greek cinema and the symbolism of it?
Well, it's a
Where to
problem.
start, eh?
Where to start? Let's start with, well, it's a problem. I think she's right, and it's something that is reflected very much in some of her films as well. It's a very defining institution for Greekness. It holds a place traditionally there for what we associate with Greek cultures and Greek understanding of self. Why these particular films rebel against it? I guess they found an opportunity where everything is breaking apart, and family is the stable thing that you're supposed to kind of hang on for dear life. That is also perhaps, if seen as a problem, perhaps we can start to have a proper conversation about what is happening to us, or what the films were trying, the world that the films were trying to portray at the time. I'm speaking as if it was that long ago. It's not that long ago. I think we're still wondering what the hell is going on. But I think that's why it holds such a it's so institutionalized and is so aligned to other institutions of government, of structure, that it creates a problem. If we're starting to see all these things breaking apart, why not family? And I think there's a criticism to be made there as one of the core, the foundational elements of Greek identity. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it goes back to what you were both saying about how his interested in systems, especially systems of governance, and then the family becomes this quite pliable analogy for working through some of the sort of more macro issues that the film seemed to be preoccupied, but it's shot through the prism of the family. So you get the incredibly authoritarian situation in Dogtooth, whereas here you get something where the framework is less clear. Their relations to one another are kind of not nearly as well defined as, for instance, they are in Dogtooth, where they're quite rigidly set within this very structured system. So here you kind of get with Monte Rosa, who is, I mean, you could make a case for other characters; they're all very interesting, but she's arguably the one that we're most trying to sort of work out as viewers as we go through it. She sort of goes from, she has kind of like a sisterly role, she has like a motherly role, and then she finally has this daughter's role. It's kind of revealed actually, in the final act that there's this unresolved grief in her around her mother, that suddenly becomes kind of a catalyst for sort of like looking at this character in a totally new way. I think Alps is is a much more mysterious film in many ways than Dogtooth is, which is ambiguous, but I think is far more sort of concrete in those in the commentaries that it's providing. Whereas I think Alps has this kind of almost very sort of almost like this mysterious nature to it, where you can kind of read those lines that are being drawn by characters in quite contradictory ways sometimes. And I don't think that necessarily takes anything away from the film's interest, but rather kind of really asks, going back to that idea about, Lanthimos films don't necessarily give you answers, they just give you lots and lots of questions. I think Alps is one of those films that's full of questions, and part of that is its kind of very strange sort of family relations that it kind of is depicting.
I think there's also something to say about the mythologized Greek family. There are two different kinds of family in Greece, in that you have the traditional, extended, strong relation, form of support kind of family, but you also have that. You want to maintain that kind of myth within an environment that is increasingly individualistic and neoliberal and punishing. And that system of support is not quite as functional. and so that dysfunction kind of registers in the films that start questioning that kind of myth, I guess, of the Greek family, this extended.
But it's also somewhere to hang on to when you don't have systems. Sometimes you hang on in clinging to something that works in a bad or a good way.
I guess so, but I guess, but he doesn't spare us that, right? Yeah. He says that try all you want, you won't have anything to cling on to, and that's the desperation of his films, I think. Right. In the end,
I'm gonna have one more question, and then we'll take it to the audience. I just want to ask, quoting Lanthimos now, I help her, Tsankari, with her film. She helps me with mine. This is the only way to get movies made here. That was said in 2010, by the way. There are no real producers in Greece and no public money anymore, but at least it's done out of love, end of quote. So this quote discusses the collaborative DIY nature of independent filmmaking during that period. There was an Athenian community of performers, directors, photographers, shared actors to compensate. Where are we now in 2025 after, the success of this period? I know there are more co-productions. I know there are more local production companies. Where are we now?
We would like to think we are in a more stable period, but my sources tell me that filmmaking in Greece doesn't have regular funding and the way that they would establish it as a credible industry that produces a set amount of films, not a great number, but a set amount of films that can travel, that can that they know they can confidently depend on funding. But co-productions help, and I guess what that early 2000s, mid 2000s period has shown to filmmakers is that there are other avenues, more guerrilla, more experimental ways of making the films that they want to make. I'm not sure there is a reliably established system of funding Greek cinema of all kinds, not just the one or two films that will travel to international festivals to represent the country. I think there needs to be more work done there. A bit more.
I think the reality is, like, with all smaller nationals, well, basically anywhere outside of, say, Hollywood, Indian cinema, the very, very kind of structurally intact film production contexts, the reality is film must be commercial because it's expensive. It takes an awful lot of people. All of those people need to be paid. And there is this ongoing tension that we see actually evidently also in, Lanthimos' cinema as well, which is the tension between, that kind of that art house sensibility, that we're going to do things on our own terms in our own way, and that need to increasingly be commercial. I mean, Lanthimos is interesting for being a filmmaker who, on the one hand, hasn't compromised massively in terms of the more shocking content and stuff. He's yet to go and make a superhero film, but I can't quite imagine what that would look like. There's a question for the audience here. Which superhero would you like Lanthimos to direct? But on the other hand, actually, he has been a bit of a success story. His films have increasingly become more expensive. I think it was a £4 to £6 million budget, $1 million budget on The Lobster. By the time he'd got to The Favourite, he was up to about 15 million or so. The Favourite made almost 100 million at the box office. Poor Things made even more. I don't think Kinds of Kindness made an awful lot of money. But Poor Things, I think, made well over 100 million on about a 30 million budget.
It was sold out here back to back to back to back.
Yeah.
It was our most biggest selling film of the year.
And he is like a critical darling as well as commercially successful. One of the things that some people are a little bit perplexed by are the kind of the problems with a film.
He combined.
Yeah, is a problem. But for a lot of people, that film was seen as a liberating piece of grown up filmmaking, and it has, and it certainly still has its fans. I'm more inclined to sort of agree. I think Poor Things is one of his weaker films, but I actually think he's most interesting when he's working with Philippou, the screenwriter, who returned on Kinds of Kindness. But The Favourite and Poor Things, both being written by Tony McNamara, have a very different sort of style to them. And actually thinking about the style, because those ones are most famous for, you know, the fisheye lenses and all of those very strange angular shots. And, you know, he's always taken a very angular view on his subjects, even if it's been, you know, largely less ostentatious up until that point. Even if you think to Alps, you know, Alps doesn't have the showiness of The Favourite or Poor Things, but there's a really interesting use of kind of like tight focus there. Quite often we're looking at the back of someone's head whilst they're processing something, and all of the background is out of focus. And, you know, there is this, although it's less conspicuous than, you know, the fisheye lens that you see, you know, when they're walking down the corridors in The Favourite, you do get these moments of kind of formal kind of flair, which do nevertheless kind of transmit the same messages about this kind of, you know, this being at sea within these situations. So yeah, I think to sort of answer your question, Lanthimos is kind of both like kind of very much a part of this initial movement, although we haven't really talked an awful lot about the Weird Wave label yet. Was that?
I hope the audience will ask about the Weird Wave,
okay, fine.
because we don't have so much time.
Fine.
Oh.
I can stop there.
Discuss amongst yourselves.
Are you sure that we don't have any? Do we have a next film?
In 20 minutes.
Can we have 5 minutes of audience questions? And we're gonna go very quick.
Sorry, we talk too much.
Let's take it to the bar. Honestly, you'll stay at the bar.
Yeah.
Sure, we can stay
Please
at
come and speak to us. I'm so sorry. I got carried
Thank you.
away.
Thank
So
you for
sorry.
coming.
Thanks very
Thank you
much
for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming. Please get one of these on your way out and come to speak to us at the bar. Thank you.